Welcome back, and I'm going to build a little bit on what I was talking about in the last video, with the right way to think about a postmodern identity in a budding kind of sexual relationship with yourself. So the reason I'm talking about this is because if you've been listening to all my playlists for the past 3 weeks since I've started creating them, I've been almost evolving with contentious ideas, or ideas that are typically not really discussed in public uh, with any kind of updated, uh, almost voice. So usually things that are kind of new to a tradition, we almost reaffirm what tradition will kind of prescribe by just kind of reinforcing, like, if the secular or the greater society is doing something new, we should stick to what we know and hold true to it, because this is what the prophet did, this is what Christ did, this is what we understand from our tradition, and because it's familiar and this is like the healthy result, we should continue to do that. This is fine. This is kind of a conundrum. I'm still kind of trying to communicate in a way to say, I think being a postmodern person, we have to understand both perspectives without creating an enemy of the other, or almost to say they're inherently immoral because they're choosing a more progressive outlook on how to live their life. If you take a step back, you can say, well, how would you view the traditionalists, for example? And for me, somebody who, like in high school, I never really engaged in any of what adult entertainment would kind of look like. I used to find a lot of joy in just reading, just kind of hanging out with friends at the mall, trying out makeup, trying out new clothes. And for me, that was fun. For somebody else who enjoyed partying and wanted to be more of an extrovert, that would have been like, yeah, I mean, that's fun, but can't there be anything else? Because that could seem like you're limiting yourself. And even if it is somewhat of a limiting existence, you can think, yeah, I mean, maybe in my next life, like, I almost have to see myself as, maybe I haven't progressed to a form of comfort to where you are, and where you're being able to exemplify almost like a more social life. And I have to almost internalize a type of ethic, so that I know my boundary and I know my limit, so that when I do try something that's a little bit more extroverted, I know when I can pull back and what to listen to about my body, so that even if I die before I get to that point, my next life will almost have this subconscious in it, so that I can build and kind of progress in that way. So it's not to say that one form of life is better than the other, but it's almost to say, if you do want to kind of hold back and just almost appreciate maybe a little bit more of what your tradition has and why you value what you do value, um, don't try to create moral judgment or comparisons, or say, one is better than the other, but almost just allow yourself to say, well, just like, a more progressive group is allowing me to exist and kind of remain traditional, I also have to kind of allow them to remain progressive, and we shouldn't try to get in each other's way. So the reason I want to talk about this from almost like a evolving sexual self, or like an identity with a sexual self, is that sometimes we have these grandparents, for example, who come from these traditional families or backgrounds, or from wherever it is outside of North America, and they almost expect that these values will be inculcated in their kids, who are now parents and have maybe young kids or even like adult kids, and they want that tradition to continue to almost propel itself forward. And there's nothing wrong with that, but it's almost to say, if it doesn't look so blatant, it doesn't mean that it's not there. Like, we tend to almost talk about it as though that's the way the reality is. That, if I don't see you looking devout or going to church, or the way you talk is, somehow signifying that you believe in God as like some kind of force that you believe in or that you pray to, then I should automatically assume, you and I have nothing in common, and we have nothing to learn from each other, and we should keep each other separate from each other, is a very maladaptive way of thinking. And the reason I say this is because as kids growing up, we don't see that difference. Like, we might notice, like, at the beginning, my parents said we don't do this, so I won't. And then as you grow up into adulthood, you kind of wonder, like, well, why don't we? And then sometimes you ask questions, and they'll say, well, because you know what, when we were growing up, we weren't allowed. I was like, all right, that's fine, but that was like years ago, and that's a completely different context. And even if it was in this context, I mean, if I do try it, what's going to happen? So if you can think, what if I decide that I want to go to the movies with my friends and it's going to be like a mixed group of guys and girls? Then people will say, oh, but you know what? We believe in relationships not existing between genders before marriage. So if you're too young and you're not quite ready for marriage yet, then having those relationships is just going to create a problem. It's going to create a mess of your emotions. And, we'd rather just sidestep that all together and just wait until you're ready for marriage. And then you'll find somebody that will be suitable for you and we'll go from there. So then you think, okay, I mean, we've been doing that like as a second generation immigrant, as it were. Like I was born here in Canada, but being somebody who's my friends from maybe I'm 40, so I have friends from like 20 and onwards have been getting married and have tried this kind of way of living, and they'll have their own perspectives on how it worked, how it didn't work, what are some things that they can improve on, what things they want to keep. But we used to think back then that because we have this almost formed way of existing and being, that we might have lesser rates of divorce. But we know now that is actually not true at all, because the more that we know about ourselves, the more we evolve about how our identities can form and the constructs we can build about ourselves, we kind of want to experiment a little bit about who we are before we commit to somebody in almost like a lifelong kind of commitment. So you can think, you know what, maybe I haven't thought about having any kind of understanding about what sexual intimacy looks like, or that I should think about sexual gratification being like an integral part of a marriage. Some people just think we just get married to procreate and that's the end. Then you think, I mean, that's not really, I mean, I can see why that would be almost like difficult to just say, I mean, is that it? Like, and so some people will go to arranged marriages and then they'll think, yeah, I mean, in some communities, it's just because we want to contain certain values within a tradition. And it's almost to say, like, in doing this, like in getting married in this fashion, it's almost to say, what we're going to maintain some kind of cohesiveness within our tradition or our like legacy moving forward. And you think, okay, I mean, I'm allowing for all of that, and I can see why we would want to think like that. But in a postmodern world now where there's diversity everywhere and there's so much to learn by integrating new ideas to what you already value, why not try that? And why not assume that people want the same thing for themselves as well? Like, it's not just us that in a tradition that want that. Like, everybody's doing that. And people who maybe are revisiting where tradition kind of started might be like the most secular person you would have thought of, or the most postmodern. And then they're just thinking, I wonder, they just have this like event in their life and they have this really big question, and then they go back and then you find that the way they understand life can actually be very spiritually meaningful, and you wouldn't have really assumed that of them. But you were missing out because you almost kind of want to block that they would have that intrinsic value in them, or that capability or potential in them. So if we understand back to the origin stories or the creation stories where God says, I've created all humanity, jinn and humans, to worship me. And people often say that this means it's to get to know God. So if you think about that, you're like, well, yeah, I mean, we do and we don't. But then if you think in a deeper way, then you say, yeah, it becomes a very, very individual endeavor. I mean, it can be collective in some way, whereas some people go to a service together once a year, twice a year, depending on how they value what they can learn from these gatherings. But it's still like they'll all come away with a completely different narrative from what they heard, and then had to integrate that in their life. So the reason I want to almost ask this is because sometimes what we value at a specific time around what makes like a good partnership changes. So if I was 18, I used to think, what the almost characteristics that I have in mind for somebody that I would want to kind of live with or like partner with, for like any length of time, would have these characteristics. And then as I'm growing older, like past 18, maybe going to university, maybe getting a job, maybe getting to know a lot more people, I might change my mind. I might be more flexible. I might be a little bit more lenient about like some rigid ideas that I used to think, yeah, no, maybe I should kind of ease up on what I used to expect would have to be like a certain standard that I wouldn't kind of assume would be like a deal breaker. And as you're doing this, you're almost like, you know what? I think I want to like throw away my list altogether, and I want to actually get to know a person, and then see, well, based on this one person and me, like what's our interaction like. And so from this, like Muhammad, he used to actually say, one of his recommendations is that people get married at a young age, because in that way you almost know, I'm forming my ideas about the world, you're forming your ideas about the world. And if we do that almost in a symbiosis, or like a kind of interconnected way, we're not necessarily forcing one idea over the other, but it's almost like we're building together. Like, I haven't really thought about this. What do you think? And then in that way, you're almost building a friendship within the marriage, if it ends up being a marriage, or within like whatever the relationship or the couple is. And that builds a certain confidence in your own idea of how you want to understand yourself, and then how do you understand yourself relative to another, and then how we want to learn to concede about ideas. So if one person decides, yeah, if we had kids and they decided that they didn't want to believe what we believe, I think I'd have to want to force myself to be okay with that, rather than constantly harping on this is what we value and then almost instill that in them. The other parent might say, no, I mean, my parents and my family, I know they wouldn't agree with that. So then between the two of you, you have to decide, well, what would we do? And then you have to think, well, what kind of influence would we allow from outside of just the two of us as a couple? This is kind of what I want to almost segue into is in my last video, I talked about how once a person becomes an eclectic kind of postmodern person, just because they're trying to understand different historical figures and what they want to kind of glean from each one and how they want to build themselves up to view the world, how would they want to identify? And then you might say, maybe they won't identify as anything. They'll just call themselves secular, or like if they have to do those census boxes, they'll just say other and then just leave it at that. And that's fine. Maybe that's fine for them. But then once, and maybe they're married, or they've already chosen their partner and they're kind of compatible in that way. But then what happens if you have kids who decide, you know what, we're going to almost bypass what you and your, like their, my kids would kind of bypass what we did if I was part of a couple, and then they want to go back to maybe the tradition of my grandparents, and they want to say, okay, I'm going to identify as Christian. I'd be like, okay, that's fine. But then what happens now if a Muslim family decides, well, we're almost interested in you as a family, but we're going to have a hard time understanding like why your son or daughter won't accept Islam, for example, and they want to remain Christian. And for me, I'd be like, I don't have a problem with this, right? And then you have to kind of go back to the like your other couple, and then your grandparents, and then wonder like, how do we deal with this, and why is this even up to us? Like this is going to be their life moving forward, how they choose to raise their kids. But we almost want to create a bridge where families can get to know each other. We can like have picnics or gatherings where we get along. We're not fighting about a correct doctrine or a correct way of kind of engaging with the world, as it were. And in a civic society, we almost have like common laws and common rules that we all sort of adhere to anyway. So it's almost over and above that. There tends to be some kind of particularities that people kind of are habituated to, and they feel comfort in keeping within their kind of lifestyle. But it doesn't necessarily, I mean, for some, it might be like if some people have kind of created a habit of constantly praying. So like in Muslim families, they pray 5 times a day. If that's something that somebody has as a practice that's personal for them and they feel it's important to maintain, that's fine. If somebody else decides, I can't remain in this partnership because you don't pray, it almost assumes like, do you know like what my future is going to be? Like what, like who's to say who's better off? Some people will say, well, prayer almost prevents harm from coming into your life. You can say, okay, that's fine, but my heart's beating, my mind is thinking. How are you to know that I'm not in some way contemplating the universe in a spiritual way that maybe just isn't discernible to any passerby? So the reason I bring this up is that Omar, who was the second successor of the Prophet, was known to be, before he became Muslim, he was like the most antagonistic person to Muhammad. And he was known to be somebody who enjoyed drinking alcohol. He would build, like he'd laugh at himself. He'd tell this later on when he embraced like a newer version of how to understand monotheism. But he'd laugh at himself. Like he'd say, I'd build almost like an idol of dates. Almost to say like, I don't know what the idea behind it was, but as though like, this is the God that feeds me maybe. And then he'd eat it and then be like, I mean, is that all it can do? Like it's already very, very limiting. So he'd almost allow himself to almost reflect on the message that Muhammad brought is just so eye-opening and it's just so mind-opening. And then for some reason, I was just so limited and was aggrieved that I'd have to almost change my habit. And it's almost like he was almost recognizing an innate part of ourself that can be slothful or almost like spiritually lazy, or I have to come out of this habit, but I don't want to, even though like in a civil society right now, we've probably overcome a lot of those habits. Maybe now we just have to figure out moderation. And so another practice was this is kind of something it's always, I think it depends on the culture and the time and maybe the age group. But women, just the concept of how to understand women is always something that is very contentious, and it's constantly being revisited, like about women's rights. So he had buried actually one of his daughters when she was an infant, and he was once crying and laughing at the same time, and he was saying, so one of the companions asked him, like, why this kind of mix of emotions? And he said, when I was burying my daughter, as I was like covering her with sand, she was like brushing the sand off his beard. So you think of these incidences, and then you wonder, like, oh, wow, that does sound like really barbaric. Like, what would have been the logic to do that? And maybe back then it was because women were used as concubines or entertainment, so it was almost like, this is like a responsibility I don't know how to deal with, and I don't want that for her, so therefore I'm just gonna end her life. In today's day, you would say, yeah, I don't think that we would do that. But there are parts in the world where women have like literally no rights. Their opinions are not valued at all. And anytime they try to progress, they're just kind of stunted again. And it's just like, well, we haven't really changed a lot from 1400 years ago, even though we want to revere the prophetic way. So it's like, but think about what the prophet did with the women in his time, and try to use that lens of like where they might have been relative to each other as genders, and then bring that to the fore and say, where's the progress available for us to kind of think about and synthesize and kind of reflect on, like, who the women were then and what they were allowed to do, and then think of like, wow, they could like be just as assertive and as productive members of society as anybody in any kind of context or geography. So I'm bringing this kind of to a perspective that might look from almost like, if I step outside of everything that's happened in human history, and I'm just thinking, okay, I'm going to look from fields of study. So if I think evolution, and I'm thinking, okay, so some people assume that we evolved from monkeys, and they can say, well, then why are there monkeys right now? And you can say, well, because it's survival of the fittest. Like, you can say, some monkeys traveled in certain areas and they've developed the capacity to, maybe sustain themselves in some way, and they've evolved until they've become human. Other monkeys, maybe in certain areas, haven't, so they're still where they are. So you can see the analogy there. And then you think maybe these humans have become engineers, and maybe now they're interested in artificial intelligence because they think, well, if we evolved from something that was as primitive as just like a chemical reaction, and we understand we came from Earth and its elements and metal, artificial intelligence, like all these metals are basically from the Earth. So it's all almost like one seems more sentient than the other. But I mean, with artificial intelligence, we can hook up a robot to a human, and then we have almost like a cyborg of some kind. So then you think, okay, so now let's go into education. I think we have to think of pedagogy, and how do we want to understand how to think? And then there you have to stop then, because then you think, yeah, that's true, because I'm almost already limited. If I put an algorithm in and I even have it hooked onto a human, they're almost supporting each other, where it's difficult to think, this is almost like an ecosystem, those two. How do I bring that out into the world? Right? So it's almost like, okay, you might have like a clone twin, and you just pause that there. And then you think from another perspective, if you think of the creation story from like the Genesis or the Torah, or like an oral tradition that's inspired and kind of passed on through time, you might think, okay, so like we'll think of priests or the priestly class that's kind of evolved from different, so like in the Hindu tradition, it's called the Brahman class, I think. So all these different traditions that have hierarchies of scholarship within a scriptural understanding of religion, as it were, almost passing through time. And so their understanding of life is more metaphysics. So something that's not necessarily tangible or something that can be measured scientifically, but they definitely feel it. And the result of it is the way certain people can change, because they try to embody these teachings. So they might be more focused on language rather than the mathematics of something, but they don't negate the math and the science. And then now you have language and you have pedagogy, and you're trying to understand how to bring them together. And this is what basically Sufism is. Sufism is a way of understanding like the mystical aspect of humanity that can basically be the groundwork for any kind of life. And from that, you can build all these different doctrines on top and decide like what can we kind of do away with that were past laws that were needed in primitive society or in antiquity. But now that we're in such a like a postmodern world, you know, some of these restrictions can be relaxed like almost entirely. So if you think from that perspective, then you want to say, okay, how does this have to do with anything anymore? Like we can just be whatever we want. We can be artificial. We can be. But then you think, but then how limiting is that? If I have a technology that's working, like if I'm trying to run a company, right, and I'm relying on a human and I'm relying on this like machine to do something. How do you configure that like as a person, like a bureaucratic system? Like does this person have rights? Like how do you understand like what to do here? And then a person who wants to say, well, I'm inspired as a human and I don't want to rely on this technology. Do I have to now? And then how do we meet in the middle? And then if you're trying to build a family, like how do you understand like the ethics of all of this? So this is like it's a brand new idea, and it's almost to say like there has to be a way to understand how to think about reality, or how we affiliate with each other as humans in a technological age, without always relying on a grouping of how we think about God. And the reason I want to say this is because by doing that, it almost automatically assumes that there's an other who, I can say agnostic, who's somebody who hasn't concluded something about how they think about God. But I almost want to say we're all agnostic, because anytime we come to a conclusion about God, we're like, yeah, this like this idea resonates with me really well right now. And I used to do that. Like when I'm reading scripture, sometimes I'll take screenshots of a verse, because it'll like, if I'm having a problem at work or in life, I'll be like, man, this really speaks to what I'm challenged with right now. And I just pause it and I'm like, I want to reflect on this every day. And then maybe, the next day I look at it, I'm like, why did I do this again? And it's almost like that's to me, that's God. It's almost like that's already done. Like you've already overcome it. You've maybe resolved it. You've integrated it. Now there's a new challenge. So it's almost like that idea of, if something was a problem for you yesterday, don't assume it's going to be a problem with you forever. If you've resolved it, good, keep going. And then hopefully you'll come across other individuals who may complement or supplement something that you had like a glimpse of an understanding with, and then be like, oh my gosh. And then you have that kind of, it's almost like that connection with the other person. And then you'd be like, oh, when I was at work the other day, this happened. And then it doesn't have to always be based on scripture. It can just be like just life. Like life is so spiritual. And that's what Muhammad came with. Like before he had that revelation at the age of 40, it was just, and Ibrahim, he was just contemplating the universe around him. Like it all just speaks to you, right? If you just listen to nature or the way things evolve, or even like just the seasons. So I'm going to try to keep, I almost want to keep the idea of relationships and building relationships from a young age almost alive, because this is something that I know within the Muslim community it's always contentious. How do we try relationships, and then if they're temporary, they end up just being temporary. And then how do we involve like a sexual relationship? Is that allowed? Is it not allowed? And then how do we understand virginity? This was something that I had to kind of grapple with. It might have been 4 or 5 years ago, where there's a town or like a city about 3 hours away from here, where there was a family who it was like, I think, several siblings, and they had a sister who knows what happened, but they ended up killing her, because I don't know if she had some kind of sexual intercourse with another boy or what happened there. But to think like, what a loss of a life. And then it just takes me back to that story of Omar. It's like, what is it that's a responsibility of a woman that almost creates this, I want to say it's almost like this dictator-like characteristic from men or women, who knows, but that almost wants to cage a woman and be like, just stay in this bubble.